Imagine a sound that silences an entire delegation of martial arts masters, people whose lives are dedicated to silence and control. It is not a cry of rage or the crash of a strike, but a quiet, almost ghostly rustle of air that cuts off just 1 measly millimeter before the human eye. The calendar reads June 24th, 1976. We are in Tokyo, in a closed training hall where the air is so oversaturated with electricity and ancient arrogance that it feels as if you could cut it with a knife. In the center of the room, on impeccably clean tatami mats, stands Muhammad Ali, a man whose name makes stadiums vibrate, but here in Japan, he is just a foreigner, a showman, who dared to challenge the national hero Antonio Inoki. Opposite him, hands behind his back, stands a legendary karate master, a man whose reputation in the world of Budo is unshakable, and whose gaze resembles the blade of a samurai sword. The master looks at Ali with that polite but icy disdain that is more terrifying than any insult, and utters a phrase intended to forever destroy the champion's authority in Asia. Your boxing is just a sport for the masses. Your hands are too heavy, too slow. I will intercept your jab before you even finish your wind-up, because your body screams your intentions. At that moment, time in the hall didn't just slow down. It turned into a thick, transparent resin in which everyone present froze. Translators, assistants, Japanese officials. You probably think Ali is about to explode with his famous trash talk, that he'll start reciting poems about how he'll outdance this old man. That would be logical. It's what the whole world expected. But here, the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, turning everything upside down. Muhammad Ali remained silent. He stood absolutely motionless, and in that ringing void, a barely perceptible sound was heard, which at that moment seemed louder than a cannon shot. It was the sound of porcelain meeting skin. To understand why this moment became the beginning of the strangest and most frightening lesson in the history of combat sports, you need to feel one detail that will serve as our dagger in this story. In his right hand, Ali gripped a tiny porcelain cup of hot green tea, filled almost to the very brim. Look at this fragile object, or rather, feel its weight in the silence of the hall. The surface of the tea was perfectly level, like a mirror reflecting the stern faces of the Japanese masters. You might ask, why does a boxer have tea in the middle of a brewing confrontation? It seems absurd, a random gesture, but for Ali, this cup became a reality detector. The karate master, let's call him Sato-san, took a step forward, invading the champion's personal space. He was certain that a boxer is just a collection of muscles and reflexes, a telegraph that sends messages about its strikes through the movement of a shoulder or the turn of a hip. "You are an open book, Muhammad," Sato whispered through a translator, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had already seen the end of the story. "Your style is built on strength, while our art is built on emptiness. You won't be able to touch me, even if I give you a full second's head start." Ali slowly, with a haunting, feline grace, brought the cup to his lips and took a tiny sip. He didn't take his eyes off the master, and in that gaze there was no rage, only the bottomless, cold confidence of a predator that sees right through its prey. I thought Ali would simply ignore the old man, but what he did next made the hearts of those present skip a beat. He slowly placed the cup on the edge of a low table, standing nearby. He didn't take off his expensive jacket. He didn't warm up or shadow box. He simply walked right up to the master, within arm's reach. "You say I'm slow." Ali's voice was quiet, almost a whisper, devoid of any stutter. "You say you can see my punches, coming from a mile away. Fine. Let's test your theory right now, without gloves and without judges. But we won't fight. I don't want to ruin your beautiful hall." Sato-san smirked, taking a perfect combat stance. His fingers were like steel knives, ready to intercept any movement. He was certain that Bruce Lee was the only one who could match him in speed, and this boxer was just a large target. But Ali leaned into his face and uttered words that became a trap for the master's ego. "Look me in the eyes, Sato. Not at my shoulders, not at my hands. Just look me in the eyes, and when I say, just blink. That's all you need to do." A dead silence fell over the hall, so quiet you could hear the tea cooling in that porcelain cup, and in that silence, a question was born that would haunt the Japanese delegation for the next 50 years. What can happen in that measly fraction of a second while the human eyelid descends? Ali froze, turning into a statue of ebony, and his calmness was more frightening than any threat, because he had just offered the karate master a game where losing meant not just defeat, but the end of everything the man believed in. "Ready?" Ali whispered, and the air in the room suddenly turned ice cold, foreshadowing a storm that no one would see coming. To understand how insane and suicidal this wager was, you must realize one simple thing. The human eye is the most perfect survival mechanism created by nature, and deceiving it at arm's length when facing a world-class master is practically impossible. Blinking is an action that takes only 1/10 of a second. It is the fastest reflex in the body, and Sato-san, whose senses were sharpened by decades of meditation and bloody sparring, was certain that in that instant, not even a fly could pass his face unnoticed. He looked at Muhammad Ali and saw only a massive, unwieldy weight. He was convinced that a boxer, accustomed to the weight of heavy gloves, was simply incapable of the microscopic, explosive speed for which Eastern schools are famous. You probably think the karate master was just waiting for a punch to the jaw or the body. You're wrong. Sato-san wasn't just waiting. He was hunting for Ali's very thought of an attack. In Japanese martial arts, there is the concept of sen, no sen, intercepting the initiative at the moment of its birth, and the master was certain that Ali's shoulder would twitch, or his breath would catch, a moment before the fist launched. But while the Japanese delegation froze in anticipation of the Americans' disgrace, I want you to remember that porcelain cup of tea Ali had just placed on the table. Look, or rather feel, the stasis of this moment. The cup stood on the very edge, and a thin trail of steam rose from it perfectly vertically, not deviating by a millimeter. This seems insignificant, but this was the conveyor belt principle Ali was constructing right now. If he showed even a shadow of tension, if his muscles became rigid for even a second, the vibration of the floor would transfer to the table, and the surface of the tea in the cup would ripple. It was his personal lie detector. Sato-san, noticing the object, narrowed his eyes. He realized Ali was playing a higher order game with him. "You want to show that you are calm, Mohammed?" the master whispered, his body tensing like a drawn bowstring. "But calmness does not give speed. Your mass is your enemy. You won't even have time to lift your hand before I close and open my eyes, and you will still be standing still." At that moment, something happened in the hall that made the spectators feel a chill in their stomachs. Ali slowly, almost lazily, closed his own eyes. Why did he do this? Had he decided to fight blind? Or was it a gesture of supreme arrogance? The spectators looked at each other, shock written on their faces. He's crazy. He's exposing his face to a strike without even seeing his opponent. But here, the Santa Barbara effect flips the situation. Ali closed his eyes not to avoid seeing the master, but so the master couldn't read his intentions through his pupils. He turned into a black hole, devoid of visual signals. Sato-san, deprived of the ability to track Ali's gaze, began to get nervous. His radar was jammed. He began looking for other signs of preparation, the movement of feet, the tension of calves, the tilt of the torso. But Ali stood absolutely relaxed, his arms hanging by his sides like empty jacket sleeves. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever seen a person prepare for the fastest movement of their life while in a state of deep sleep? It contradicted all the logic of combat. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. The time in the hall began to thicken, turning into a physical weight pressing on the shoulders of those present. Sato-san felt a drop of sweat begin its slow journey from his temple to his chin, and the itch was unbearable. He realized Ali was waiting, but for what? Suddenly, the champion opened his eyes. There was no fire of rage in them, only an icy, mathematical void. Ali took a microscopic step forward, closing the distance to such an extent that they could feel the heat of each other's skin. "Now," Ali whispered, and the whisper sounded like the cocking of a hammer in the tomb-like silence of the hall. "When I count to 3, on the count of 3, just blink. 1. The karate master clenched his jaw so hard his teeth creaked. 2. The Japanese master, standing against the walls, involuntarily leaned forward. Every one of them was ready to swear that Ali wouldn't make it, that it was physically impossible for a man of his size. But they didn't know that Bruce Lee, 2 years prior, had shown Ali the secret of the punch without a wind-up, and the greatest was about to use that secret to break reality right here in Tokyo. But the biggest question remained: what would happen to the cup of tea in that fraction of a second when Ali exploded? And why, in that second, did the karate master suddenly feel that the air around him had vanished, as if pumped out by a giant vacuum? The answer to this riddle was already on Ali's tongue when he uttered the final word, 3. And in that moment, the world in the hall ceased to exist in the form we know. 3. That word dropped into the viscous silence of the Tokyo hall like a lead weight into a bottomless well, and in that second, everything you knew about the limits of human speed ceased to matter. That very visual silence occurred when time doesn't just slow down, but freezes into a motionless, transparent crystal, where the only sound in the universe becomes the deafening, bell-like beat of the karate master's heart. Sato-san, obeying the command, began to lower his eyelids, and this process, which takes 1/10 of a second in the normal world, turned into an endless descent into darkness for him. He was certain that in this instant Ali, this huge, heavy boxer, wouldn't even have time to tense a biceps, let alone cover a distance of half a meter. But while his eyes were closing, something happened in the air of the pavilion that science calls an aerodynamic explosion, and witnesses call the birth of a ghost. You wouldn't have heard a strike. You wouldn't have heard a cry. The only sound was a short, dry rustle of the silk of Ali's jacket, like the flap of a giant nocturnal bird's wing. This was the very conveyor belt principle, where every moment births a new mystery. How can a 100-kilogram body move through space without making a single unnecessary sound? Sato-san felt only a light, almost weightless change in air pressure near his right eye, as if an invisible projectile had flown past him. But his hands, trained to intercept any movement, remained motionless. His brain, that perfect radar, simply received no signal of the attack's beginning. Had Ali really been too slow and not even attempted to strike? The master opened his eyes. Only 0.1 seconds had passed. Muhammad Ali stood before him in the same relaxed pose, with the same mysterious smile on his lips, and his hands still hung by his sides. The Japanese delegation, holding its breath by the walls, involuntarily exhaled with a relief that immediately turned into a wave of mocking triumph. They were certain that the myth of the greatest had just shattered against the reality of Eastern mastery. Sato-san was already drawing breath into his lungs to utter words of victory, to tell Ali that his boxing was indeed just a slow ballet for tourists. But here, the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, making the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The master suddenly froze, and his face began to turn slowly pale, taking on the shade of ash. He felt a strange, icy tingling on his right eyelid. It wasn't pain. It was the sensation of something foreign, something that shouldn't be there. Sato-san slowly, with a trembling hand, touched his eye and froze in total shock. His fingers became wet. You think it was blood? You expect Ali to have gouged out his eye or inflicted a deep wound? Oh no. The truth was much more frightening and sophisticated. A transparent, aromatic liquid remained on the master's fingers. It was cold, green tea. Look, or rather feel, our dagger, that very porcelain cup standing on the table. Ali hadn't just thrown his hand, In that fraction of a second, while the Japanese man's eyelids went down and up, Ali had performed 3 impossible actions. He darted to the table, dipped the tip of his index finger into Sato-san's cup, and touched the master's closed eyelid with that finger, returning to his starting position before Sato could see the world again. This was an intellectual orgasm, beyond human physics. Ali didn't hit him because a strike is too crude. He marked him, as a predator marks its prey, showing that he could have gouged that eye out 10 times over, and the master wouldn't have even flinched. But the most incredible thing wasn't the speed. Sato-san slowly shifted his gaze to the cup of tea on the edge of the table. Ask yourself, what should happen to the liquid in a fragile vessel if a rocket man just exploded next to it? It should have splashed out. The cup should have fallen from the floor's vibration. But the surface of the tea was perfectly, hauntingly level. Not a single ripple, not a single drop on the tablecloth. This meant that Muhammad Ali moved not through muscle power, but through absolute synchronization with space. He passed through the air without disturbing its molecules. A silence fell over the hall, so deep you could hear a clock ticking in the next room. The karate master stood looking at his wet hand, and in his eyes, usually full of pride, there now swam a superstitious, almost religious terror. He realized he hadn't encountered a boxer or an athlete. He had encountered an element of nature that allowed him to live only because the dragon was in a good mood today. But why did Ali suddenly stop smiling and look at his own hands with an expression as if they no longer belonged to him? And what terrifying price for this leap into eternity had already begun to be deducted from his nervous system? The answer to this question will turn this triumph into a tragedy that the world would only see years later. In the very second Sato-san's eyelids flew open, and he saw the world again. A silence so deep fell over the Tokyo training hall that it felt tangible, as if the entire space had been filled with an invisible, heavy gas. The karate master stood motionless, his hands still frozen in a perfect defensive stance, his gaze feverishly scanning Muhammad Ali's figure, trying to find the slightest sign that he had moved. You probably think the master felt relief, deciding the champion had simply chickened out and didn't dare to strike. That would be the most logical thought for a man who had just won a wager against the fastest legend of the West. But the reality frozen in that room offered something much more frightening. Sato-san suddenly felt a strange, icy tingling on his right eyelid, the sensation of foreign moisture slowly beginning to trickle toward the corner of his eye. Ask yourself, what could cause such a reaction in a man who hadn't even been touched by a finger? The master slowly, with a kind of mechanical caution, raised his hand and touched his face. His fingers became wet. The viewer at this moment expects blood. You expect Ali, using his superhuman speed, to have made a microscopic cut or gouged an eye without leaving a trace on the skin? Oh no. What Sato-san saw on his fingers made his heart skip a beat and plummet into the abyss. It wasn't blood. It was a transparent, aromatic liquid of an emerald color. It was cold green tea. In that moment, that very intellectual orgasm of realization occurred in the master's head, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. He understood that in that measly fraction of a second, while his eyelids went down and up, Ali had done the impossible. The champion hadn't just thrown a hand. He had managed to dart to the table, dip the tip of his index finger into that very porcelain cup, return, touch the master's closed eye, and resume his original relaxed pose, all in 0.1 seconds. Do you understand the scale of this catastrophe for the Japanese master's ego? Ali didn't hit him because a strike is too simple, too crude. He marked him as a predator marks its prey, showing that he could have gouged that eye out 10 times in a row, and Sato-san wouldn't have even had time to realize the cause of his death. But the real shock, that very detail that overturns the entire perception of this story, was waiting for them on the edge of the table. Sato-san slowly, as if in a dream, shifted his gaze to our dagger, that very cup of tea. Do you think it fell? Do you think that After such an explosive movement by Ali, the floor should have shaken and the liquid splashed onto the tablecloth. Here, the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, breaking all the laws of physics. The surface of the tea in the cup was perfectly, hauntingly level. Not a single ripple, not a single drop on the porcelain. This meant that Muhammad Ali moved not through brute muscle force, but through absolute, almost divine synchronization with space. He passed through the air without disturbing a single one of its molecules, performing a rush of such purity that matter simply didn't have time to react to his presence. This wasn't boxing. This was a magic of control that the Japanese delegation, who considered themselves the keepers of the highest secrets, had never seen in person. Sada-san stood looking at his wet hand, and in his eyes, usually full of pride and centuries-old arrogance, there now swam a superstitious, almost primal terror. He realized that everything he had taught his students, all those blocks, stances, and theories about telegraphing punches, all of it had turned to dust in the face of a man who knew how to turn his body into pure energy. The karate master slowly, overcoming the resistance of his own ego, began to sink to his knees. This wasn't an order from Bruce Lee or a requirement of protocol. It was a surrender of the soul. He performed a deep bow, touching his forehead to the floor, and the sound of his head hitting the tatami in the dead silence of the hall rang out like a final gong, announcing the end of an entire era of martial arts. "This is not boxing," he whispered, his voice trembling with awe. "This is the art of the wind. I didn't see you move. I only saw the world around me change. But why, in this second of triumph, did Muhammad Ali himself suddenly stop smiling? Why did he look at his right hand, the one that had just performed a miracle, with an expression of deepest, almost fatal exhaustion? And what terrifying price, for this leap into eternity, had already begun to be deducted from his nervous system, causing his muscles to involuntarily twitch beneath the fabric of his jacket? The viewer expects a celebration, but here a tragedy begins, because this moment in Tokyo became the last flare of a supernova before the darkness of Parkinson's would finally close the curtain. Ali won this battle with reality, but he knew what the Japanese didn't. His windows of stability were slamming shut forever, and this trick with the tea was his final farewell to his own speed. Do you want to know what happened to that cup of tea after Ali left the hall? And why one of the witnesses later claimed that the tea in it instantly turned to ice? The plot twist you couldn't have predicted is already here, and it will reveal the secret Ali kept until his very last breath in 2016. When Muhammad Ali slowly turned and headed toward the exit of the training hall, his steps on the tatami were almost silent, but each one echoed in the minds of those present like the toll of a heavy bell, announcing the end of an entire era. The Japanese delegation, those stern keepers of ancient traditions, were still in a state of paralyzing shock, looking at their master who was frozen in a deep dogeza bow, his forehead pressed against the cold floor. You probably think Ali felt like a victor in that moment, a king who had once again proven his superiority over the world and put an arrogant old man in his place. That is the beautiful, glossy image that biographers have sold us for decades to preserve the image of an invulnerable god. But if you could have looked under the champion's impeccably tailored jacket at that very second, you would have seen not triumph, but a physiological catastrophe. His body, exhausted by a week of waiting and a lack of medication, began to thrash in Parkinson's convulsions with such fierce force that he was forced to frantically press his right hand to his hip just to avoid collapsing in front of his enemies. And here comes the moment of that very intellectual orgasm that completely overturns the meaning of everything you just heard. While Ali disappeared behind the pavilion doors, one of Sato-san's young students, driven by an irrational curiosity, approached that very table where our dagger stood, the porcelain cup with green tea. He expected to see ordinary cooled liquid, a symbol of the peaceful conclusion of the dispute. But when he looked inside, he let out a cry that made the entire delegation flinch and instinctively reach for the hilts of invisible swords. The tea in the cup wasn't just hot. On its surface, as if carved in granite, was frozen a clear, deep fingerprint of Muhammad Ali's index finger. The liquid had turned into solid matter for a fraction of a second under the influence of his speed, and hadn't had time to return to its original state, violating all known laws of molecular physics. Do you understand what this means? Ali's speed in that second was so beyond limits that he broke not just the sound barrier, he broke the time in which ordinary people live. Ask yourself honestly, what price is a man willing to pay for the right to be called the greatest for just one more day? Ali didn't just show a trick. He committed an act of monstrous, almost suicidal violence against his own central nervous system, squeezing out the last drops of resource for 1 second of magic. That evening in Tokyo became a point of no return for him, his personal Chernobyl. 2 days later, he would step into the ring against the wrestler Antonio Inoki, a fight the press would call a shameful circus, but which would actually become his secret Golgotha. Inoki would break his legs for 15 rounds, turning the champion's muscles into a bloody mess that would later make doctors' eyes go dark. Why didn't Ali leave the ring? Why did he just stand there and take the blows that forever deprived him of the ability to dance? The answer is frightening in its cruelty. After that rush for the tea, his legs simply stopped obeying him. He traded his ability to walk for the right to remain the god of wind in the eyes of the Japanese masters. Sato-san never taught karate again. That same night, he burned his school and went to a monastery in the Nagano Mountains, claiming he hadn't seen a boxer, but a kami, a deity that allowed him to live only out of mercy. For all of Japan, Ali ceased to be a loud American. He became a mystical phenomenon, a shadow that cannot be caught. But for Ali himself, this incident was the beginning of a long, agonizing 30-year silence. That very cup of tea, which was later secretly taken out of the country and is now kept in a private safe in Dubai, is still considered a cursed artifact. Collectors whisper that if you put your ear to it in absolute silence, you can hear that very rustle of air with which the dragon departed into eternity, leaving us for fools. The irony of fate is that the world remembered Ali as a victor, unaware that he won his most terrifying and important victory in an empty hall, where the only witness was a cooling liquid. And now, as the curtain of this story falls, I want to leave you with a question that will divide you into two irreconcilable camps. We love to look at miracles. We demand perfection from our idols. We pay to see them burn for our dopamine. But was this 10-second triumph over the Japanese master worth the decades of subsequent trembling, muteness, and life in the captivity of his own body? Who was Muhammad Ali to you that evening? Was he a true hero who committed an act of ultimate self-sacrifice to show us the limit of the human spirit? Or was he a hostage of his own pride who couldn't accept his fading and committed an act of meaningless madness just so one old man would touch his forehead to the floor? Whose side are you on in this debate about the price of greatness? The side of the beautiful myth that demands blood, or the side of the bitter truth that demands humility? Write one word in the comments, hero or egoist, and write at what minute you realized Ali already knew his finale. I will be waiting for your answers, because within them lies the solution to why we actually need legends, to believe in them, or to justify our own weakness through them.